What? The better message is back? We thought Pastor Torkelson had retired. Oh, yeah, we at the better message are back. We just took a lot of time contemplating it all. And we're back from vacation and feel much better. Thank you very much. Welcome to the Better Message. Hello, I'm Pastor Dan Torkelson, the unanxious pastor of St. John's Lutheran Church in North Prairie, Wisconsin. And yes, it has been actually prior to Memorial Day since we did the last Better Message. And I think we all remember what happened the weekend of Memorial Day. What happened was an African American man from Minneapolis um, he was brutalized by the police and he wound up dead. And the protests began. And I was watching the whole thing very, very carefully. And I was astounded, a little bit dumbfounded, um, at how quickly everything about it degenerated into living proof that the message out there in the world is just simply not better than the gospel. In fact, I think what I was wrestling with during this whole time, and it's one of the reasons why it took so long to get to this better message, one of the things I was wrestling with at the time was I was just simply astounded at how bad the message was. I think the devil might have been trying to tie my tongue a little bit, not by telling me I didn't have the better message, but by saying, watch how bad I can make it. It'll be so bad that you won't know how to talk to it. And it's not that the better message doesn't have a lot to say about this. In fact, it offers a worldview that really clarifies a lot of things, even in the midst of all this chaos that has ensued since George Floyd's death. It's just that it took a while for me to watch the developments unfold and finally get down to that sort of eureka moment where I knew what I really was dealing with and how to talk to it. That happened a few weeks back. It happened in the confluence of two events. One that happened here in the state of Wisconsin that made national headlines, and that was a riot at the state capitol in which two statues, the Wisconsin Forward statue was brought down, and a statue to a Norwegian Lutheran abolitionist from Racine County was also brought down. And in the midst of it all, a Democrat state senator from Milwaukee, who was openly gay, was beat up by the same crowd as he was encouraging them to settle down, which was good for him, regardless of his politics or his lifestyle, that he did not deserve that and it was just the wrong thing. The other thing that happened that same week too, and that's when the leaders of Black Lives Matter came out and basically discussed their open Marxism. And I learned a lot from that. And at that point, I realized what I was really dealing with. I realized that I had the components now of a better message. But before I get into all of that, I need to kind of set up or reestablish a point I made in an earlier better message that is going to inform this video. And that is that I did a video some time back. You can look at it on the YouTube channel called Keeping It Real. And in Keeping It Real, one of the things I was arguing was that one of the reasons why I'm glad to be a pastor, and I think Christians should look at being a Christian this way as well, is that we preach and we teach and we live and we understand the world against a basic principle of interpretation called law and gospel. And the great thing about law and gospel is that it is settled on the truth. It tells the truth about us as human beings and our sinful natures, and it tells the truth about God. In fact, the truth about God and the Christian God, the biblical God, is so different from all the other quote-unquote false gods that the great thing about the law and gospel is that inside of that truth, we're allowed to be real about ourselves as humans and real about a God who's loving and gracious and compassionate, as opposed to Allah and all the others who are just simply lawgivers who make you drop and give them 50. It's against that dynamic, though, that capacity to be real with the law and to be real with the gospel, that demonstrates how we can use this thing called the better message to understand what took place here since Memorial Day. Here's what I saw happen. What I saw happen was I saw about 10 minutes of a video that is obviously longer than 10 minutes, made it to the media. And all of a sudden, a local police brutality story centered in Minneapolis became a national issue. I want to ask a question. Why is my opinion on what happened to George Floyd important? If I live outside of Milwaukee and a good five hour drive away from where all this happened, I have relatives who live in Minneapolis, and I'm deeply concerned about what they think happened there and what they think is happening to their city, because I love them as my relatives. But those 10 minutes got out into social media, and then social media turned this from a local story into a national story. And if there were peaceful protests going on involving Minneapolis natives concerned about an event of police brutality in which a person died, I get it. I totally get it, and I have no problem with exercising free speech that way. But these riots are pretty quickly taken over by out of towners, and part of the way you know this is, and this is what I saw happening. You saw the argument degenerate. If you remember taking geometry and you had to do those proofs, and I was lousy at them, I was terrible at them. I'm much better at it now because what that is really an exercise in logic. And I didn't quite get logic when I was 15. I get it now when I'm almost 50, um, better than I did then. And so what you had was you saw this degeneration in logic. I used to write a geometry proof by writing the first point and the last point. I always got those correct. But the points that get me from point one to point 5 or 6 in the proof, I had a hard time getting that to progress properly. Well, here's what happened. What happened was a legit concern about police brutality in a city got taken over by outsiders from outside the city. Interestingly, a good many of them were white. That's another problem. But then you also saw the argument change. And it was like my geometrical proofs. We went from a valid point about police brutality to all cops are racist. Now, there's got to be some in betweens there that demonstrate this, and they were not brought out, not by the media or by anyone protesting out in the streets. And then we went from all cops are racist to defund the police, which that makes a little more sense if indeed all cops are racist. The funny thing is I've had the privilege of serving and knowing a lot of cops in my time as a pastor, and I've yet to meet one who was openly racist. And quite honestly, despite what the video says, and again, we haven't seen all of the video, I'm not sure I'm ready to just make that judgment of the cops in the police brutality situation either. We don't know that racism was the motivation. And then there's the whole thing of, well, there's systemic and endemic racism, and police brutality brings it out, except that real hardcore research, like the sort that is done at the Manhattan Institute by Heather McDonald, indicates that police brutality numbers are way down. And then even in 2019, more white Americans were victims of police brutality than black. In fact, that almost over 2 to 1. But the numbers in both cases are just simply double-digit numbers that don't add up to 60. Nationwide, 338 million Americans, over 100 million arrests in 2019, and only 56 cases of police brutality between African Americans and Caucasians more than 2 to 1 over blacks. What's the problem? For 20 years, police brutality has actually been improving. Now, did it happen? Yeah, it happened. Was it right? No, absolutely not. But here's where the better message is better than what the kids out in the streets are saying. Because number one, they don't have facts and stats on their side, as I just demonstrated. Why does oppression happen? Why does police brutality happen? Why does racism happen? Why does classism happen? Why does any sort of form of discrimination happen? And discrimination can take a lot of forms. I mean, if we're going to talk about racism, we may as well talk about it all. Why does it happen? Well, the better message, the message of the Bible, the law in particular here is pretty clear. There's sin in the world. That's why this happens. It's because there's sin in the world. And if the statistics say anything, they actually say something pretty good, and that is that human beings can improve that situation. But if we keep it real, if we put the law to it, and this sounds cynical, but it's just simply being real. Sin and the law teach us that we'll never cure it. Paul in Romans 7 puts it kind of profoundly that even though he has this baptism and he has this salvation as a free gift of God in Christ Jesus, the good now that he wants to do, he can't seem to do. He can't seem to bring himself to do it. He keeps on doing that which he does not want to do. That's reality. That's the human life. I like to think that I'm fairly colorblind. Just a couple weeks ago, an Amazon vehicle pulled into our driveway, and an African American woman was driving it, and she had a beautiful, I think probably between a 1 and a 2-year-old, an early toddler, riding in the back seat. And I just saw the child, and I notice children whenever I see them, and I just waved at the child and smiled at him. She was very happy that I did that, and I just leaned in and I said, "I'm really glad you get to ride with your mommy." And that comes from a guy who rode with his dad. When I was a kid, used to ride on his routes a lot. And those were very, very wonderful times I had, considering I didn't have my dad for very long. So I mean, I was genuine, and the woman just smiled and she thanked me for that. And she obviously had more deliveries to make, so it wasn't a long encounter. It was a very positive encounter. I was not thinking terribly much about her color. I'm not saying I'm colorblind, but I am saying that as a Christian, I'm much more concerned about a person's humanity, regardless of what they look like. I adopted a Chinese boy went to China to go get him. I didn't adopt him because I thought I could enrich his life because he was Chinese and I'm American. In many ways, his Chinese heritage has enriched mine. And there are people in the Black Lives Matter movement right now who are sort of shouting that it's not possible to be colorblind. And what I would say is I actually agree with that, but I agree with that for different reasons than you do. I don't agree with that because of endemic systemic racism. I agree with that because of sin. And so there have been times when I've looked at people maybe by the color of their skin and judged them, or by the class that they're in and judged them. I was worried about that when I came here to North Prairie, to Waukesha County. I grew up in blue collar Dodge County, not right next door. We had stereotypes about this county. Stereotypes are the root of discrimination and prejudice. I thought of Waukesha County Heights as people who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And I was pretty blue collar as a kid. I found there are real people in Waukesha County. God be praised. I get to pastor quite a few of them. That's a wonderful thing. But the point is, we need to keep each other human. And in keeping each other human, we do recognize each other's sinful natures. When I go on Facebook, I don't judge what people put up there. I only comment if I agree or want to be funny. But the basic point is, being a pastor or being a Christian doesn't make me a police officer of people's behavior online or anything like that, which is why I don't read my news feed that much or anything like that. I don't think people need to be beholden to my opinions. The word of God I preach, that's real. And unless you can prove me wrong, you'd do well to listen to that. But I'm not preaching my opinion here. You will never solve racism. You will never solve classism. You will never solve oppression. Jesus said, rather controversially, the poor you will always have with you, even to the end of the age, which brings me to my next point. And that is that what I heard when the leaders of Black Lives Matter said that they were essentially Marxist, told me everything I needed to hear. When Jesus said the poor you'll always have with you, he knew that somewhere down the road a man named Karl Marx would come along who would prove him right. Karl Marx and the economic systems of socialism and communism that are tied to his name have guaranteed poverty in the world. No one economic system is God ordained, but even Bono, the lead singer of U2, whose personal mission in life is to eradicate poverty, has admitted that capitalism has done far more for eradicating poverty than socialism ever did. And that's true. He's got stats to back that up. We have less of a poverty problem in the United States than they do in socialist countries. What socialism did was it redistributed wealth to make sure that everybody was at a certain level of poverty, not at a certain level of affluence. And this is what makes America different. I'm not going to say better. I may believe that, and I actually do. But what makes America different is that it gives you a chance to be affluent. And surely, I think African Americans could make an argument that they've been oppressed and not always allowed to do that. That's true. Um, I think at the same time, if we assess why that is at like the full level, like it is with all people, it's important to take a look at how we ourselves limit ourselves. I'm not saying that it's all the fault of African Americans. I do think society has been structured a certain way that has put them at disadvantages. But the flip side of the coin is they can look at themselves too and say, well, what can we do differently? How can we handle that differently? I'm not going to give prescriptions or say, but I think I will always think that that's a worthwhile attitude. It is not a worthwhile attitude to stand in the streets and blame everybody for everything, everybody else for everything. What the young people of today out there in the streets have working against them are some big things. Number one, most of them were not raised in healthy families. Number two, they were not raised in very good schools and taught in very good schools. And number three, because those families didn't create a God presence in their life, they don't have a strong sense of humility. They think they're right and that they need to force their rightness down everyone's throats. And when you're tearing down statues to abolitionists, you're tearing down monuments to Lincoln, and you're tearing down statues and monuments to black regiments in the Civil War, let's just say you need to stop and think about what you're doing. You need to stop and ask, how am I wrong? Not how is the other person wrong? And so at the end of the day, the title of this better message is A Better Humanity. And we will never attain that. We will never attain a better humanity if we are always right. If we're always right, then we deny the number one fact of human life, and that's sin. And if we deny sin, we certainly don't need a savior. At that point, anything Christ did for us is moot and pointless. It takes getting real about oneself to see just how really God dealt with me and you. To the young people out in the streets, and I'm actually shooting this video for one I happen to know, whom I have, whose family and herself I have loved as a Christian for a good long time now. I am so sad to see how hopeless your message is. Since the mid-90s, the music you listen to is nihilistic and hopeless. Probably since a newer generation of teachers has emerged in public education, the secular humanism of public education has continued to dominate the message to such a degree that you don't come out of school, number one, smarter, and number two, more hopeful and more able to engage the world knowing how to think. You've been taught what to think. And the funny thing is, you don't know your history very well, and if you did, you would never go in with Marxism. But you've not been told how to think. And this whole exercise of this video was a chance to show you a little bit how to think. The only universal truths I'm aspiring to in this is that the law is real about our sin and the gospel is real about our Savior. I don't care if you are black, red, white, green. The law says the same thing about all of us. And until we look honestly at ourselves and seek something better for ourselves, we should not be in the business of forcing something down someone else's throat. When I was 25, I did not have the answers to everything in life. And I'd like to think I didn't think I did either. I had a great education, I had a much better education than most kids out in the streets. But that didn't mean I knew everything. And now as I'm closing in on 3 months to my 50th birthday, there's one thing I surely do know, is that I do not know everything. If we want a better humanity, it can't begin by pointing out the wrongs of everyone else. It won't happen. You won't get that. If we want a better humanity, we look inwards. realizing that we'll never solve the inequities of this life. We can improve them, and we have, including on things like police brutality. We have. That's the sad statistical truth. But you'll never have a better humanity without the gospel and the forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ. I'm going to talk a little bit about American history. Why does it surprise so many people to hear that Thomas Jefferson had a child with a slave that he owned? For those of us who live the law and the gospel, who are keeping it real, a story like that shouldn't surprise us. Thomas Jefferson had a sinful nature, and it caused him to do a little philandering, because it was sex outside of marriage, any way you look at it. The fact that George Washington owned slaves, same thing. That our founding fathers had flaws is not surprising. Does it change the fact that George Washington was a man of impressive stature? No, it doesn't change that at all. The fact that we know so much now about Martin Luther King Jr.'s infidelities, and we know so much about Jack Kennedy's infidelities, does it mean that King's I Have a Dream speech is not a great speech? No. Does it mean that Kennedy's Kennedy's only inaugural address in '61 wasn't the great speeches, one of the great speeches of American history? No. Abraham Lincoln didn't have a lot of moral failings, but he had a severe depression that left him oftentimes suicidal and incapacitated. Yet he wrote the Gettysburg Address, and that second inaugural address, which is one of the great speeches of history. These people were fallen, flawed human beings. Robert E. Lee, it's said that his soldiers, when they would look back and see him on his horse, gained so much inspiration from just seeing him on his horse. That takes a certain kind of presence. And if I look at Robert E. Lee, I see a man who certainly was on the wrong side of the Civil War and the wrong side of a lot of issues. Doesn't mean that he wasn't at times an extraordinary human being, but he was a sinner. It means I'm not going to tear down his statues. I'm not going to tear down Washington's. I'm not going to tear down Christopher Columbus's. I'm not going to tear down Lincoln's. I'm not going to tear down anyone's, because if I see that statue and decide to learn more about that person, and I learn the whole unvarnished truth, it doesn't surprise me at all. Some of you watched the Better Message have been very, very flattering to me, but there's a sinful nature in me too. I'll still provide the better message because it isn't about me, it's about Christ. And if it's a benefit to you, good for you. By the way, there can be more of these again at a more frequent pace, I promise you that. But let's get back to just keeping it real for just one more minute. That young person that I'm talking to here, you need to know one thing. You were raised by sinner saints, Christian mom, Christian dad. They were not perfect, but Jesus loved them. And all the people you're being critical of out in the streets, they're certainly not perfect. But Jesus' death was for them too, as it is for you. And if you can learn to think that way, then you'll have a better humanity. You might have a real equality as well. That's it for the Better Message. We will be back on a more regular basis. I will be a little less topical and a little bit more on the use of the word better in Hebrews as we look down the road. But I really hope you have a blessed day, and I hope that in the midst of it all, you are still able to keep it real. Number one thing you can do to keep it real, go ahead and watch this video, but turn off the dang TV, please. We're not designed to handle 24/7 news. Have a great day, everybody. God's blessings.